Welcome back. Now that we've laid out the general relationships in historical materialism and the general contours of the way in which society and history develops, now what we want to do in this video is talk about his specific application of these general principles of dialectical materialism to the history of Europe and the Mediterranean, the general Mediterranean area. Now, Marx never claims to be giving a universal recipe for all of world history and human history, no matter how it develops. He's only saying that it's the economic conditions that determine the social conditions, that determine the worldview, religious and philosophical ideas, and not vice versa. And therefore, you must always go to the particular situations to see how they develop. And he's doing that specifically with the European and the Mediterranean historical development as he sees it. Now, of course, we start off with a Neolithic society where there is no classes, there really is no social system or anything, simply because everyone is at a subsistence level. The economy is at such a low level that everyone just shares and divides the labor and then shares the results of those labor. So there can't be any division into haves and have-nots. Technology is needed, a new development, and the new development is agriculture or farming. Once we have agriculture and farming, then we need private property, don't we? We need land, and we need the land to be possessed and stably possessed, and therefore you start to require social distinctions and class distinctions. And this leads to surplus because now we have enough food to go around plus more. And the question is, well then, how does that surplus get distributed? It doesn't, because now that we have certain groups of people who are still hunters and therefore warriors and need to protect their farmland from raiders, you have a group of people called warriors who are trained to specifically do that. They gain their dominance through power and conquest, and thus inaugurate the first class level of history, or epoch of history, which he calls the Asiatic Ancient. And there's a lot of controversy over whether these are two different epochs or not. I'm treating them as one because I'm just giving you a general contour, because they do share this. They share that what happens is you get private property. This property is for the production of food, farming, and therefore the main means of production is agriculture. Agriculture becomes dominated by a master class that then conquers and gains its domination through literal conquest. And thus, those they conquer become the slaves, and we get our first basic class division between the master and the slave. Now, the way this specifically happens in the Roman and Greek areas is that you have this master group that then conquers the surrounding areas, takes these people in as slaves, and you have this division between citizen and slave. And those who own these huge tracts of land become, in the Roman case, patricians. And the patricians then make the laws, create a Roman republic, which therefore what? Has the domination of the landowners and the warriors over the farmers and those who were tasked to slave out in the land. So what does that mean? Well, you see, this is not, remember, this is a process, okay? And so as this conflict works its way out, what tends to happen is those who were slaves gain for themselves positions in society as well. And so they become, in the Roman case, plebeians, the basic people. And the plebeians, as a result, then become in conflict with the patricians, and always over rights and land distribution. And the plebeians try to get more land from the patricians, and the patricians try to keep their domination. And so this creates this uneasy compromise until the empire period, when the patricians and plebeians are eliminated when Rome conquers all around. And as they do that, then the Romans themselves, plebeians and patricians, patricians then become just citizens, Roman citizens, who are now the masters of this civilized world. And the income of slaves now is from foreigners and barbarians. And so thus it becomes a conflict between the civilized and barbarians during the empire period. Barbarians are taken in as slaves. The citizens now are the general masters over what is an empire, but in name only a republic. But as then civilization spreads, barbarians are civilized and they become part of this general civilized. But as the influx of barbarians increases, the Roman Empire changes in characteristic. It changes so that you can no longer distinguish between civilized and barbarian. The barbarians come to dominate all of the major areas, so that even Roman emperors come at a barbaric origin. And so the empire is in general weakened, and the distinction between civilized and barbarian no longer holds up, so that when the barbarians from the outside, the final barbaric waves come in, there's no Romans left. The barbarians dominate, conquer, and set up their own little feudal kingdoms, where the barbarians now become the dominating ones, the nobles, the aristocracy, who then take over through conquest and just general assimilation into the old empire and take over huge tracts of land. Now, since these lands are all divided because of the barbaric invasion and civilization decays, you get these localities that are basically independent of each other. And so the government itself transitions into these local fiefdoms. And whereas before the basic relation between master and slave was upheld by conquest, and now the basic relation can't be by conquest because nobody's strong enough to completely dominate all of Europe. You only have these small tracts of land, roads are no longer passable, and you have to protect yourself and your local community from invasions of other barbaric tribes. And so thus the division of these noble lands is given by a king, but the king does it by contract, what you might call a fiefdom, a feudal relationship of lord to vassal, where throughout the system, everyone is given rights to a certain extent because they all need each other. And so the lord gives land to his vassal, a knight or a nobleman. And the nobleman then promises loyalty and that they'll provide supplies, money, and soldiers when they're needed for defense. And then they're given lands, and these lands then have farmers there that are already there and that are tied to the land, and a lord-vassal relationship is created there. Again, a reciprocal relation, a relation where you have now serfs. Serfs aren't slaves per se, because they are just in a contract with the lord that they will provide food and sometimes foot soldiers in case of war, and that the nobleman will now provide what? Protection from these roving marauders, Vikings, Norsemen, remaining barbarian tribes that are still raping and pillaging. And so thus you have this contracts of protection and loyalty that become the major social relations, the relations of production. The serf provides the supply and sustenance, and even certain types of tools and weapons, and the nobleman is the warrior that will protect the general area and then come together under the king when they need to have a general war. And so we now have a transition to this feudal system. And of course this feudal system sets up the relations of production and social relations to the noble and the serf. No longer is this a relation of pure dominance. It is dominance, but now it's coded under a new ideology, the ideology of a hierarchical set of lord-vassal relations. It is not an exchange relation, it's a barter relation. I'll give you this if you give me that. And so, but again, this evolves. As these different fiefdoms and feudal kingdoms become stronger and stronger, they need more weapons, they need more goods manufactured. The serf himself congregates in these little towns, And these towns then develop craftsmen and guilds that supply nobles with their supplies of war and gold, and the serfs with their general farming supplies. And so we have elementary manufacture that starts to build up, and towns, and therefore city dwellers that then become distinct from the serfs. And as a result, because these towns all being separated and they can't produce everything on their own, you start to have, with the improvement of roads, also trade that goes on. And then so you get the development of what are called guilds. These are particular types of unions of workers that develop a system by which someone can go from being an apprentice to a master craftsman. And thus we have a system of feudal manufacture that develops. An economy with new tools like windmills and hydroelectric power that then powers the grinding of grain and the production of cloth and shoes and armor with this development in technology. And so as a result, you get a new class that's distinct from the serf that now is in conflict with the noble, the town dweller. And this town dweller starts to develop and gain more and more money and wealth through trade and the development of technology. And when that technology develops to the point where you have manufacture and markets open up so that the demand for supplies and the demand for goods outstrips the feudal system's ability to do it, then the guilds themselves get marginalized. The manufacturers start to take over and make larger crafts shops, which then become factories. And the development of more technology, which makes things like an assembly line process occurs through the development of steam and electric and rail systems. And thus you get the Industrial Revolution. And through the Industrial Revolution, the towns are marginalized, cities develop, huge factories, mass production, which then amasses the wealth and power and property into the hands of a few bourgeois city dwellers who then become the ones who hire wage laborers. And thus the transition from feudalism into capitalism. And it is here where the nobleman is marginalized and no longer has all of the power and wealth because the states themselves require the support of the city dweller, the middle class, the businessman, to supply their centralized power. States become centralized, and thus the new power structure arises between the bourgeois capitalists in conflict with those who are simply wage laborers, the proletariat. And unlike every other system, the proletariat, the development is into higher and higher levels of technology. And when this technology develops, what happens is the worker themselves needs to be less skilled because the technology is better. And we want simpler tasks. We want greater specialization so that even the skills that are needed are so narrow that anybody can do it. And so the wage laborer becomes someone who becomes in competition for money. Profit becomes the main motive, not allegiance or loyalty or reciprocity. And this pushes the development of this conflict where the haves become more haves. They become more amassed with wealth. They have more and more, and the have-nots become poorer. They don't develop into a new class. In fact, they grow as the income gap grows to such a point where now you have fewer and fewer wealthier dominating more and more poor who are completely dependent on the capitalist corporation for their wage labor. In our next video, we will then explain the internal contradictions of this system and how it gives rise to an inevitable revolution where the proletariat, the wage labor, must inevitably destroy the present system. And in doing so, because that system becomes so widespread, you have not a new class arising of haves, but a complete elimination of classes because of the complete elimination of all distinctions in the proletariat. And we'll see how that occurs when we show his process of reasoning in the Communist Manifesto.